came on Daystar and you publicly affirmed their relationship as being of the Lord. Can you do that in good conscience without having talking to Lisa to get her side of the story?
I don't care. The great thing about being my age is I just don't care. I've got a good quality of life.
No one expected this to happen on live TV. When Pastor Jimmy Evans sat down with Joni Lamb, the conversation started calm, until it wasn't. Within minutes, his words turned the entire studio silent. What he revealed about Joni, her choices, and what's been happening behind the scenes left the audience frozen. Viewers flooded the chat in disbelief. This wasn't scripted. This was raw, real, and completely shocking. And it changed everything. No one expected Jimmy Evans to speak. For years, he had been the calm in the middle of the storm. The wise pastor who comforted the Lamb family, the trusted voice that always seemed steady no matter what was happening behind the scenes. He wasn't the kind of man who stirred drama or made public statements. That's why, when he finally broke his silence, the world of Daystar and everyone who followed it stopped in shock. It all started with a leaked conversation, a private talk that was never meant to be heard. In it, Jimmy spoke about a family meeting that had haunted him for years. He described the moment he was asked to do something that didn't sit right with his spirit, to convince Jonathan Lamb to submit to his mother, Joni, as if she were the literal voice of God in his life. It wasn't just about family respect or leadership. It was about obedience. Unquestioned, absolute obedience. Jimmy said he hesitated, but in that tense, heavy room, he went along with it. He told Jonathan that his mother spoke for God, trying to keep peace, trying not to make things worse. But the words felt wrong even as he said them. When he had finally left them, that moment stayed with him like a weight he could never put down. He had convinced himself that he was doing the right thing, protecting the ministry, keeping unity. But deep inside, he knew that silence wasn't loyalty, it was fear. Years passed, and Jimmy kept that regret buried, thinking it was better not to reopen old wounds. Until now. When the recording surfaced, he didn't deny it. He confirmed it. Calmly, humbly, he admitted that he had made a mistake, that he had helped uphold something that wasn't godly but controlling. The impact was immediate. Viewers, pastors, and longtime supporters of Daystar couldn't believe what they were hearing. For decades, Joni Lamb had been seen as a pillar of faith, but now people were asking hard questions. Was this how the ministry really operated behind the scenes? Was authority more important than truth? Jimmy's quiet confession lit a fire that no one could put out. He didn't raise his voice or accuse anyone. He just told the truth, and that truth was louder than any sermon. He said he wanted freedom from cover-ups, freedom from control, and a chance to finally be honest. For him, breaking the silence wasn't about revenge. It was about cleansing, about letting the light in where darkness had been hiding. And in doing so, Jimmy Evans didn't just expose a moment. He exposed a system. It was supposed to be a moment of healing. That's how it started, with hope, with the quiet wish that maybe, after all the pain and confusion, the Lamb family could finally sit in the same room and talk honestly. No cameras, no producers, no polished smiles. Just family. Jonathan Lamb had been carrying questions for years, watching everything around him crumble. His family, his faith, and the ministry his father had built with such conviction. When he called for a family meeting, it wasn't out of anger or pride. It was out of desperation. He wanted the truth. The meeting wasn't held in a fancy boardroom. It wasn't about Daystar business or television schedules. It was personal. He invited everyone who mattered, his siblings, their spouses, old friends who had stood by the family, even Jimmy Evans, the man who had been both counselor and mentor. Jonathan hoped that if everyone could just speak freely, maybe the wall of silence that had built up after Marcus Lamb's death would finally come down. For a brief moment, it felt possible. When Joni arrived, Jonathan felt a flicker of relief. Maybe she was ready to listen. Maybe this time would be different.
The truth and to not be a part of a cover-up. And that's led us to where we are now completely free, not attached to any sort of major institution or any type of control, to where we're able to be a voice for truth and to be able to stand up against injustice and be a voice for others out there who are have been through abuse or been through a difficulty or been part of a culture that encourages people to cover things up. We're so excited that we can help be a force that can shine the light on the darkness and allow the Lord to do a cleansing work in the body of Christ. So thank you all for all the people that have written to us and supported us and loved on us. It's really just been so overwhelming.
But the moment the meeting began, that hope started to fade. The atmosphere in the room was tight, almost electric. No one raised their voice, but the tension spoke louder than words. Jonathan started carefully, with respect. He talked about the pain that had followed Marcus's passing, about how quickly everything had changed, how decisions were being made without discussion, and how the heart of the ministry, their family, felt broken. He didn't accuse anyone. He simply asked for honesty. One by one, others began to share. Some spoke with calm sadness, others through tears. They talked about feeling ignored, replaced, or shut out. Years of unspoken hurt came pouring out. For the first time, people were saying what they had only whispered before. But then, when it was Joni's turn to speak, everything shifted. Instead of listening, she reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and set a timer. "You each have 60 seconds, she said flatly. At first, everyone thought she was joking. She wasn't. 1 minute per person. 60 seconds to unpack years of grief, confusion, and betrayal. The room went silent. People exchanged stunned looks, not knowing what to say, but the timer was already running. Each person spoke as best they could, racing against the ticking seconds, trying to fit a lifetime of pain into a minute. When the last person finished, Joni stood up, looked around the room, and said that everyone there was operating in fear. Then she turned, picked up her things, and walked out. No prayer, no hug, no closure. She had a flight to New York to see Doug Weiss, and that was it. The room stayed quiet after she left. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner. Everyone just sat there, trying to process what had happened. It wasn't anger that filled the room. It was heartbreak. Jonathan realized in that moment that the woman he had hoped to reach wasn't really there anymore. Not in the way he remembered her. Something had hardened. Something had changed. What had once been a ministry of love and family had turned into a kingdom of control. Jimmy Evans, sitting near the corner of the room, felt it too. He would later admit that the meeting didn't feel spiritual at all. It felt tense, orchestrated, almost like a performance. When someone turned to him and asked him to tell Jonathan to submit to his mother, he froze. Part of him wanted to stay out of it, but in that moment, he gave in. He repeated what they wanted to hear, that Joni was the voice of God in Jonathan's life, and that he needed to obey her. Yet, he needed to obey her. The words hung heavy in the air. Even as he said them, Jimmy felt the weight of regret pressing on his chest. For Jonathan and his wife Susie, that moment was a breaking point. They walked out of the meeting not angry, but completely hollow. Something inside them had cracked. They knew things would never go back to how they were. They couldn't keep pretending, couldn't stay silent to protect an image that no longer reflected the truth. It wasn't rebellion, it was survival. They had seen too much. In the days that followed, everything grew colder. Calls went unanswered. Messages were ignored. Joni didn't reach out. People who had once stood by the family started distancing themselves. A few, like close friend and counselor Denise Boggs, tried to step in. Denise wrote heartfelt letters begging Joni to slow down, to listen, to heal before rushing into a new relationship with Doug Weiss. She warned that pride and haste were clouding judgment, but Joni didn't answer. Instead, she tightened her circle. She surrounded herself with people who wouldn't question her, people who told her what she wanted to hear. The message was clear. You either submit or you leave. There was no middle ground. That mindset, submit or go, began to shape not only the family but the ministry itself. Jonathan and Susie quietly stepped back from Daystar. They didn't make statements. They didn't air their pain online. They just walked away because staying meant losing themselves completely. Meanwhile, viewers began to notice. Jonathan and Susie were gone from broadcasts. Their absence was explained away with vague phrases, a time of rest, family focus, but the audience could feel it. The warmth that once defined Daystar was gone. The smiles looked forced. The energy was off. Emails and messages poured in asking what had happened, but there were no answers. That family meeting, which had started with hope, ended up exposing the truth that had been buried for years. It wasn't just about grief or family tension. It was about control, silence, and power. What should have been a sacred space for honesty became a line in the sand. Those who stayed had to obey. Those who couldn't left. Jimmy Evans would carry that day with him for a long time. The words he said haunted him. The silence that followed haunted everyone else. And for Jonathan and Susie, that meeting became the moment they finally saw the truth. That you can't fix something that doesn't want to be healed. The illusion had shattered. The perfect Christian family, the united ministry, the shining example for millions, all of it cracked in that one room. And from that moment on, nothing was ever the same again. Some wounds don't bleed where anyone can see them. They hide beneath years of silence, under-polished smiles, and Sunday sermons. For the Lamb family, that hidden wound began long before the cameras ever stopped rolling, before the public knew anything was wrong. It started quietly, like all tragedies do, in the space where love and denial meet. Jonathan Lamb never expected to become the one who would uncover a secret that would break his heart. To the outside world, he was the loyal son, the calm presence beside his father Marcus, the man ready to carry on the family's legacy. But behind the scenes, his world was about to change forever. It began with his daughter, young, innocent, and suddenly different. She stopped laughing the same way. She grew quieter, distant, and Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At first, he told himself it was just stress, just a phase. But the signs kept growing, and soon he couldn't ignore them. Then came the truth. Slow, painful, unbearable. The unthinkable had happened. Someone within the family, someone trusted, had hurt her. Not emotionally, but physically, in the worst possible way. It was the kind of truth that doesn't just break a father's heart, it shatters his entire world. The moment he realized it, Jonathan felt everything inside him collapse. He didn't hesitate. He didn't hide it. He went straight to his parents, expecting the people who had built their lives on faith, truth, and family to stand by him and protect his daughter. But what he found instead was disbelief and silence. Marcus, his father, was the head of Daystar, a man of power, respected across the Christian world. He listened but stayed cold. He told Jonathan that they had already looked into it. There had been an internal review, a few conversations, and in his eyes that was enough. No police, no outside investigators, just words behind closed doors. Marcus said the matter was settled. The accused was cleared. It was over. But for Jonathan, it was anything but over. He turned to his mother, Joni, hoping she would see what Marcus didn't. Surely she would feel what he was feeling. The fear, the heartbreak, the instinct to protect. But she didn't. She refused to believe him. She defended the accused, stood by Marcus, and shut down the conversation before it could go any further. "We've handled it," she said, as if those words could erase what had been done. She didn't ask questions. She didn't comfort her granddaughter. She didn't even look Jonathan in the eye. That was the moment he realized he was alone. The betrayal cut deeper than the crime itself. It wasn't just that they refused to believe him, it was that they chose image over truth. Daystar was their empire, their life's work, and in their eyes, one scandal could destroy everything they had built. So they buried it. They chose silence, hoping the secret would die if no one spoke of it again. But silence doesn't heal. It festers. It grows quiet in the dark, until it poisons everything around. Years went by, and the family carried on as if nothing had happened. There were family dinners, holiday gatherings, broadcasts about forgiveness and faith. Jonathan smiled on camera, prayed with his parents, played the part. But inside, something in him had broken forever. Every sermon about healing sounded hollow. Every talk about family values felt like a lie. He watched his parents preach truth to millions while refusing to face it in their own home, and that hypocrisy burned like fire. He and his wife, Susie, tried to hold things together. They wanted to protect their daughter, to give her a sense of normal life, but the weight of what had happened, and what hadn't, followed them everywhere. They stopped talking about it because talking only reopened wounds that no one wanted to see. But the silence wasn't peace. It was pressure. A heavy, suffocating kind of pressure that came from knowing the truth, but being forbidden to speak it. Then Marcus died, and Jonathan thought maybe now things could finally change. Maybe Joni would soften. Maybe she would want to make things right. But instead, things only got worse. Within weeks, she was back on camera, smiling, preaching, moving on as if nothing had happened. And then came Doug Weiss. A new face, a new love, a new chapter, all moving far too fast. To Jonathan, it felt like the final betrayal. His father's death hadn't even settled into the ground, and his mother was already rewriting the story of their lives. When the family meeting was called later, part of him still hoped that maybe she would finally listen. That maybe this time she would hear him, hear his pain, hear the truth about what had happened years ago. But once again, the same wall stood between them. He was told to submit, to obey, to accept his mother's authority as the voice of God. The same woman who had ignored his daughter's suffering was now demanding spiritual obedience. That was the moment Jonathan knew. There would be no healing. Not here. Not with her. Susie, his wife, had stayed quiet for years, trying to protect their family's privacy. But silence had become unbearable. She began to speak, gently at first, then more openly. She talked about the pain of watching truth buried under religion, about what it costs to stay loyal to a lie. She didn't do it to attack anyone. She did it because someone had to. People in the ministry began to whisper, to ask questions. Some, like Denise Boggs, who had prayed with the Lambs for decades, were devastated when they heard what really happened. Denise reached out to Joni, pleading with her to stop pretending, to face what was broken, to choose truth over pride. But again, there was no response. Joni didn't look back. She surrounded herself with people who agreed with her, who called her decisions anointed. She moved forward with Doug Weiss, closing the door behind her, on her son, her granddaughter, her family, and the truth itself. The damage left behind wasn't just emotional, it was spiritual. When a family that preaches truth won't face it in their own home, the foundation crumbles. The viewers didn't know the details, but they felt the shift. The broadcasts lost their warmth, their sincerity. Something had changed and people could sense it. That was the hidden wound. The betrayal that no one dared to name. It lived under the surface, behind smiles and sermons, behind carefully chosen words and edited broadcasts. But it was there, pulsing beneath every "God bless you," every talk about faith and forgiveness. And until it was faced, it would never stop bleeding. There was a time when Daystar felt untouchable. To millions, it wasn't just a Christian network. It was a place of comfort, a spiritual home that felt alive with faith and purpose. People tuned in for encouragement, for family, for hope. Marcus and Joni Lamb were the picture of unity, smiling on camera, holding hands, talking about love and trust in God. It looked perfect, but what no one knew was that behind those bright studio lights, something was slowly falling apart. When Marcus died, the world saw a grieving widow holding on to faith. But inside the walls of Daystar, something else was happening. Instead of slowing down to heal, Joni pushed forward with a speed that shocked everyone around her. Within weeks, she was back on air talking about God's plan and the future. Within months, she introduced a new man into her life, Doug Weiss. To those who knew her best, it felt too fast, too forced, like she was trying to fill a hole that couldn't be filled. At first, the public didn't know what to think. Supporters wanted to believe it was love, that God had brought her someone new after so much loss. But others, especially those close to the ministry, began to question her motives. Was she moving on, or was she running from something? When Joni and Doug's relationship became public, everything changed. The marriage wasn't just personal, it became a symbol. To some, it meant hope. To others, it screamed denial and control. Behind the cameras, the staff started to notice the difference. Meetings that used to be filled with prayer and shared vision now felt tense and scripted. People who had been there for decades suddenly found themselves on the outside. Questions weren't welcome. Doubt wasn't tolerated. And slowly, the people who built Daystar began to disappear. Some quit quietly. Others were pushed out. But no one talked about it publicly because silence was safer. Jonathan and Susie Lamb had already stepped away by then. They couldn't stand behind something that no longer felt honest. Their absence was obvious, but no one on air ever explained why. Instead, the broadcasts went on like nothing had changed. The same music, the same smiles, the same words, faith, family, integrity. But to longtime viewers, something felt off. The heart was gone. The warmth that had once made Daystar special had been replaced with polish and control. The tension reached its peak when an audio clip of Jimmy Evans leaked online. In it, he admitted that he had once been asked to tell Jonathan to submit to Joni as if she were the voice of God, not to honor her as a mother, but to obey her completely. The clip spread fast. For many, it confirmed what they had suspected. Something was deeply wrong behind the scenes. What had once been a ministry built on faith now looked like a system built on power and manipulation. The reaction was immediate. Social media exploded with questions and outrage. Supporters who had been loyal for years demanded answers. Pastors and donors began to distance themselves, not wanting to be tied to scandal. People wanted to believe that Daystar could recover. But how do you recover when trust is broken? Every post, every statement from Joni sounded rehearsed, defensive. The more she tried to control the story, the less people believed her. Inside the studio, things were just as bad. The mood was heavy. Employees whispered in hallways. Some had known about the family tensions for years, but never thought they'd see it reach the surface. Others were shocked, realizing that the ministry they loved had turned into something unrecognizable. There was a new rule: loyalty to Joni above everything, even above truth. Those who questioned her leadership were labeled as disloyal or out of God's will. As the months went on, the fallout deepened. Longtime viewers stopped watching. Churches that had once aired Daystar programming quietly removed it. Donations began to drop and sponsors pulled out. But instead of addressing the real issues, Joni doubled down. She appeared on camera smiling as if nothing was wrong, talking about blessings and revival while the foundation beneath her was crumbling. You said something about the worst part was how familiar it all looked. This wasn't the first time a ministry had fallen under the weight of pride and secrecy. But for those who had believed in Daystar, this one felt personal. It wasn't supposed to happen here. This was the network that preached about accountability and humility, about walking in truth even when it hurts. Now it was doing the opposite, hiding pain, rewriting history, protecting an image instead of people. Behind the scenes, Joni's world grew smaller. Friends who once challenged her drifted away, replaced by people who told her exactly what she wanted to hear. Doug Weiss became a constant presence, and those who questioned his influence were quietly pushed out. What had once been a ministry built by a family had turned into something more like a fortress, guarded, defensive, built on fear instead of faith.